Hey everyone, recently I did a video where I covered what were in my opinion the top 10 cards in Dash, and I wanted to continue the series by talking about what I think are the top 10 cards in RHINAR. I'll only be talking about RHINAR, I won't be talking about Leah just because RHINAR is a hero that I feel like I understand a lot better, and I don't really know much about Leah. So for this video today, we'll be covering, in my opinion, what I think are the strongest cards in RHINAR. This is kind of going to be cross-comparing between a few different things, specifically the Romping Club list in CC, Mandible Claw list in CC. Specifically in my case, the lists that I've had a lot of success with in CC are decks that can pivot in between the two, that run a Claw package as well as a defensive grindy club package as well. I think that list is extremely potent in CC, but it could change as time goes on. And then of course the OTK explosive RHINAR Blitz list that a lot of us had a ton of success with during the most recent skirmish season that ended up in a hardened cross-trap banning. I'm going to be factoring in a lot of different things into this list going further. So if there's a card that you think feels like it was misevaluated, feel free to let me know, and I'll be trying to be considerate between all the lists. Like for instance, some of these cards are a little bit lower because they only seem to benefit one version of the deck a lot more, and that version of the deck might be a little bit less well positioned in the meta right now. Coming in at number 10, we have Massacre. So Massacre is a really interesting card. So it's a brute attack action, attacks for 6, blocks for 3. It's a red pitch and it costs 3. If you discard a card with power 6 or more this turn, Massacre gains +2 and Intimidate. However, a Massacre is discarded to pay the cost of a brute attack action card, Intimidate. So what would happen is that if you discard this card to another random discard effect during your turn for a brute attack action card, you'll discard Massacre, and Massacre will trigger RHINAR's ability to intimidate one card from your opponent because it's a 6 attack that was discarded during your action phase, and then Massacre will intimidate again from its own ability being discarded. So with something like an Alpha Rampage, just simply discarding Massacre is a triple intimidate on your opponent because Alpha Rampage also intimidates once. So a really common line you can do to completely blow your opponent out is a barraging beatdown into a Alpha Rampage discarding Massacre, completely blanks your opponent's hand and quad intimidates them for all 4 cards. So it has a lot of applicable uses in that case. Of course, it blocks for 3, which is great. And the +2 and Intimidate is actually pretty relevant because it means it can be another finisher on a Blood Rush Bellow line. So you can go Blood Rush Bellow, attack with claws, and then you've discarded the power 6 to Blood Rush Bellow, so then you can attack with this at the end of the chain for 10, along with an Intimidate trigger. So it's another addition to cards like Swing Big that can be played at the end of these big, long chains. The only reason why it's a bit lower is because, like we just said, Swing Big is a better card than Massacre for that particular application. And while it does get a lot of use being discarded, unfortunately, currently in the meta, the Intimidate effect doesn't really seem to be as strong as it possibly could. A lot of decks are not trying to block or be hyper defensive anyway. The Intimidates are slowly becoming less and less of an effective mechanic. That could change in the future. Also, the fact that it only works on brute attack action cards really sucks. So if you discard this off a Wild Ride or Pulping, it wasn't a cost. You don't get to intimidate. And then also Blood Rush Bellow is a non-attack action. So even though it's a brute non-attack action, it doesn't actually meet the criteria for Massacre. So even if you discard Massacre to Blood Rush Bellow, you don't even get the double intimidate that way. So I think it's way too specific, and a lot of the times it's only relevant to Alpha Rampage, and that's like the only card you really care about playing it in conjunction with. Coming in at number 9, we have a card we just talked about, which is Alpha Rampage, RHINAR Specialization. It attacks for 9, which is a lot, and it only costs 3, so that's pretty impressive just on its face value. A 9 attack for 3 that also blocks for 3. As an additional cost to play it, we have to discard a random card, but it also has an Intimidate trigger on itself. So like we just talked about, if you were to discard a power 6, you would Intimidate once from RHINAR's ability triggering, and then once from Alpha Rampage. Also worth noting that even if you discard a non-power 6 to Alpha Rampage, it still intimidates once. That's not a needed criteria for it. This card is obviously really strong. It's incredibly explosive on high roll turns, and it's a great late game finisher. If you pitch stack this with maybe a Massacre and a barraging beatdown, it's just a one shot to your opponent that just closes out the game immediately. It's phenomenal into hyper defensive decks that want to be playing lots of defensive reactions, because if you wipe 3 cards from your opponent, they can really only block with a card. And if they're going to be playing things like Staunch Response or Unmovable, maybe in Guardian builds, specifically like traditional Bravo Showstopper, then they either lose a card they would use to pitch the defensive reaction, or they're left with the D-react that costs resources. So they just can't block with anything. This card is phenomenal into those kinds of strategies, but with the current meta, more and more I see myself sideboarding this out a lot more often. And the only times I keep it in, it's just because it blocks for 3, and then late game it can still be an easy way to close it out. But I typically only run 1 to 2 into these more aggressive lists that don't really care about the Intimidate triggers. So that's the main reason why it's a little bit lower on the list. Now, if hyper defensive decks become popular again, this shoots way up because this is probably one of the strongest attacks that RHINAR has at the moment. It's just simply only strong because of the Intimidate triggers, which are becoming less and less relevant with the current way that the design of the formats are shaking out and what the metas kind of look like. Coming in at number 8, we have Sand Sketch Plan, RHINAR's other specialization, a blue pitch, 0 cost, block 3 brute action. You're gonna search your deck for any card, put it in your hand, and then discard a random card. If the card you discarded had power 6 or more, you gain 2 action points. So if you discard a non-attack or a card that has less than 6 power, just simply end your turn there. But if you successfully discard a power 6, you not only get an Intimidate trigger, but you also get 2 action points. This deck likes to have a lot of consistency, but also likes to have multiple action points. A lot of your cards are going to be really strong and powerful, but unfortunately it's going to be difficult to get multiple action points. Scabskin Leathers can be one way of doing that, but like we just saw with Massacre, this would be a way to potentially get a card like Massacre and Swing Big and play both in the same turn, or play an attack followed by a Romping Club. So this deck can really utilize the action points if it pays off well. You just have to understand what you're tutoring for, why, and you have to evaluate the hand based on what you could possibly lose. So and this seems like a really complicated effect. I have a more beginner-friendly video that kind of breaks down how I like to think about this card when I'm playing it, how I like to evaluate my hands, and how that changes what card I go and tutor for. But I think that the card is actually really versatile and can be pretty consistent. At its worst case, it still blocks for 3 and pitches for 3, which is all you can ask for, really. Coming in at number 7, we have our legendary equipment, which is the Scabskin Leathers. This is a leg equipment, has Battle Worn 2. It'll block for 2 the first time you block with it. You'll put a -1 counter on it. Then the next time it blocks for 1, and then it'll go down to 0 defense. It doesn't break, but it is mostly used for the ability to block for eventually 3 over 2 separate blocks. But it does have an ability, a once per turn action, where you're gonna roll a 6-sided die, and then you'll gain action points equal to half the number rounded down. Quickly to break down the relevant numbers, if you roll a 6, you'll get 3 action points. If you roll a 4 or a 5, you'll get 2. If you roll a 2 or a 3, you'll just get 1 back. So you'll use your action point and then refund your action point. However, the really bad downside of this card is that if you roll a 1, you get 0 action points back, but you used your 1 action point for the turn to use it. So then your turn actually just ends on the spot. It's really not recommended to roll these. It does seem like it has a lot of upside. We just talked about why Sand Sketch Plan is even on this list and even higher than some of those other attacks that are pretty strong. It's just because of the tutor effect, but also because of the 2 action points you can get, allows you to have these really explosive turns. So it seems like this would be a really powerful equipment, not just because of the very strong blocking value, but because of the ability to gain extra action points. The problem is just that liability of rolling that 1 and losing your whole turn. Because not only did you lose your whole turn, you probably kept a hand with multiple cards. So you probably kept a 4-card hand, maybe a 5-card hand, because you thought to yourself, if I can get 2 action points, I can play 2 attacks in 1 turn. And these attacks sometimes require a random discard. So you need to keep a bunch of cards. So your opponent probably attacked you for a ton. You didn't block. And then you're cashing in on these Scabskin Leathers, giving you 2 action points. And you're thinking to yourself, well, at the very least, maybe I'll just get 1 back and then I can only play maybe 2 or 3 cards from this hand instead of all of them. And then you roll the 1 and your turn just ends. And then it goes back to your opponent and you're stuck with the same hand. And it's like your opponent just got to deal a bunch of damage to you and basically got to take an extra turn. So that ability to time walk yourself just outweighs any potential benefit of the high rolls of this card. The only time I'll roll it is if I've already lost the game, if my opponent has me down at such a low life total, or if they just have such a high board state like their Prism. And the only way I can win is if I get lucky and roll a 4 or higher. It doesn't matter at that point, because if I roll a 1, I've already lost the game. Even if I get 1 action point, I might lose the game. So at that point, it's an all or nothing kind of card, but it does have that really nice sort of ability to just throw it all at the wall at the end. I even got into top 8 during a really tough season for RHINAR where Viscerai was the #1 deck. And I got into that top 8 because of a Scabskin Leathers roll that I just needed to do. I was playing against a Viscerai, and I was just so low, it was clear I was going to lose the next turn, but I did have perfect lethal in my hand if I could roll a 4 or higher, and I just had to go all in on the card because it didn't matter. Even if they kept maybe 1 or 2 cards, I was dead anyway. And I got really lucky and I rolled a 5, and that allowed me to win the game. So I think that's a perfect application of Scabskin Leathers, are to use them when you've already lost, and there's just a small margin where you can possibly get back in. But that's kind of it. Rolling this card when you're ahead or just rolling this for no reason is really dangerous, and I highly advise against it. but it is on this list a little bit higher just because that effect can be strong, but it's mostly because of the Battle Worn 2. Pretty much any class equipment that can block for 3 over 2 blocks is just naturally going to be higher than a lot of other cards. Blocking equipment that stays around with Battle Worn is incredibly strong. The Dash list also had Teklovossen Heart around the same ranking, even though I think Teklovossen Heart is a lot more usable with the effect. It's just simply the Battle Worn just makes it really, really powerful. Coming in at number 6, we have another defensive card. We just talked about the blocking value of equipment, but now we're going to talk about the blocking value of defensive reaction. So this is Reckless Swing, a 0-cost defense reaction for 4. It actually pitches for 3, which is quite a lot and pretty significant. As an additional cost to play Reckless Swing, you have to discard a random card. So if you have no cards in hand, or if you only have 1 card in hand and it's Reckless Swing, you actually cannot play it. It is a required cost to play the card. But if you discard a card with power 6 or more, you deal 2 damage to the attacking hero. What's really important about this is that this is textless damage. It's not like Arcane Barrier. So there's only a few cards that could actually stop this, but for the most part, this can just be guaranteed lethal on an opponent. So if your opponent is at 2 or at 1 and they attack you and you play Reckless Swing, they're just dead on the spot before their damage can even go through. Even if they play an attack reaction, the damage doesn't go through, and they're technically just dead to Reckless Swing immediately. This card is really good, not only because of its ability to close out games, but I think only because it pitches for 3. I think if this was a red pitch, I think that this would maybe be ranked 10 on the list, if maybe not on the list at all. Why this is so good as a blue pitch is that a lot of the cards we just saw, specifically cards like Massacre or Alpha Rampage, cost 3. So this perfectly pitch stacks itself because you don't want this early game, right? If your opponent attacks you on turn 1 and you play Reckless Swing and they go from 40 to 38, it's really not that significant, right? You don't really gain that much. But if they're at 2 and now they're dead on the spot to it, obviously that's way stronger. You want to pitch this and you want this to be one of the last cards you draw every single game. So you need a way to pitch stack this. You need a way to get this out of your hand. Now this naturally is just begging to be pitched for resources because it's a blue pitch, which is actually pretty rare in RHINAR. That's why we also rank Sand Sketch Plan pretty well. Is just because on top of the conditional sort of tutor effect that sometimes has a lot of nice payoffs and is applicable across most of the list, it also has pitches for 3, which is just really good. And so if you can pitch this to play Alpha Rampage early game and then you redraw into Reckless Swing late game and then you can kill your opponent on the spot, or you pitch it to play Blood Rush Bellow and that way you can clear a non-attack action out of your hand for the discard effect and then also maximize resources by pitching a blue. It synergizes so well with the deck. I think it's incredibly well designed. I love the effect. It's very strong. Your opponent also will sometimes just give you cards so they never go to 2 just because of the threat of Reckless Swing. And if they don't respect it, then if they're at 2, you can usually just safely block out for the rest of the game until you find it, and then they're just dead on the spot. So because of all of that, I'm ranking it pretty close to the middle of the list. It's just a very powerful card, obviously works in every single build of the deck, whether it's the Blitz version, because not only is 20 life easier to get to your opponent to 2 with, but also just pitching for blue into Blood Rush Bellow. Obviously the club version likes it because you can pitch it to club and then draw it late game to close the game out, and then the claw version in CC likes it for the same reasons the Blitz list does. Coming in at number 5, we are halfway through the list. I'm actually going to cheat a bit, and I'm going to include both the weapons, so the Mandible Claws and the Romping Club. So the Romping Club is pretty much the go-to weapon in CC. You'll play a very sort of defensive deck that's blocking with all of RHINAR's block 3 cards, specifically for Malcolm the Wraith and Crucible of War. A lot of the cards, pretty much every card we've seen today is at least block for 3. Even the legs, strangely enough, block for 3 with a Battle Warrant. You're able to play this really defensive deck and then block down to 1 card and swing this Romping Club for 4. The additional upside of maybe triggering its effect and giving it +1 is kind of nice to close out games, but it's not really relevant most of the time. You're just playing it as a solid value weapon that utilizes a lot of the yellow pitches in the RHINAR list. And so it's a very strong weapon. Of course, if you compare it to something like Winter's Wail, it's obviously outclassed, but that's just the nature of the newer sets. I mean, the fact that this was printed in the original Alpha set and is still a relevant weapon that does a lot is just a testament to the weapon being very strong, but also a breakpoint of 4 off of 1 card, also just being a very strong fundamental. And then we have the Mandible Claws, which are one-handed, so you can equip both, and they attack for 3. For 2 resources, but they will go again if you discard a card with power 6 or more. Obviously not impressive on their own. These are really abused with drawn discard effects that have go again. So things like Wild Ride or Pulping or Blood Rush Bellow are the premier ways to play these weapons. So you'll play Blood Rush Bellow, and these are each brute attack, so they'll get +2 each, and they'll attack for 5 with go again, and then so you can attack once, attack twice, and you'll deal 10, and then you can play another thing at the end of the chain. or you can play a card like Wild Ride and then pitch some resources and attack for 6 more, but over 2 instances. These cards are just really strong, and they're pretty much the enablers of a lot of these strategies. I don't think that Brute is a class that doesn't care about its weapon. It's actually very tied to its weapon. And a lot of the cards in the deck are just different ways to enable that. They are also able to play with just the attack actions, because the attack actions can be pretty strong and disruptive. But I think that there's a lot to say about the weapons and how strong they can be. I actually really deliberated if I wanted to put this higher on the list. I just can only say nice things about Barraging Beatdown. Barraging Beatdown is such an outperforming card into almost every deck. It feels relevant in any list. So Barraging Beatdown is just a 0-cost Intimidate, but if your opponent does not block your next Brute attack with at least 2 cards, it'll actually buff it. So the red one buffs for 4, the yellow buffs for 3, and the blue buffs for 2. So let's break down how these cards can be used across each of the builds and why they're good in each of them. So in the Blitz list, obviously this is good because it can high roll your opponent really hard. If you actually play a Barraging Beatdown into a Alpha Rampage, that'll just simply triple intimidate your opponent. And if you discard Massacre, it quad intimidates your opponent and takes all 4 cards from them. So you'll have openings in Blitz where you can draw a red Barraging Beatdown and a Alpha Rampage and just wipe your opponent's life total on turn 1. Even if they get to keep 1 card, it's only 1 card, so the buff effect from Barraging Beatdown is applied. You'll attack them for 13, and they can only block with a 3 block maybe, and so they'll just take 10 damage on turn 1, and that's just absurd, right, in Blitz, so it's super abusable. You can play it after you draw Blood Rush Bellow and just wipe their hand even more, and then your first claw attack will come in for probably enough to be lethal, honestly. It allows for these really almost problematic levels of high rolling in Blitz, and then in CC for the same reason, you can play these really aggressively in the claw builds and just pressure your opponent's life total. But then a very interesting interaction is that this will buff the Romping Club, so you can keep a 2-card hand where you play maybe a red or a yellow Barraging Beatdown, and then you'll attack with the club, and the club will either come in for 4 if they block with 2 cards on the club, which is really bad for your opponent because now your opponent is blocking 6 block onto a 4 attack weapon, or it just gets to come in for a bunch of damage. And this is really good into like non-block metas specifically. So when Briar was popular, when Starva was popular, even Chain, these are decks I don't really want to block very often. And so if they're blocking with 2 cards, they're not really going to have a turn, especially with a deck like Starva or Briar. So this was pretty much guaranteed to be a 2-card hand that always did maybe 8 or 7 damage, which is really good if you're just trying to slowly grind the game out. This card was always relevant. It's relevant into Wizards especially because it makes them have to commit to a play on the table immediately, or else they may lose the card that they wanted to use. So if you're playing against Kana, they may lose a card they were going to activate Stormstridus for, they may lose their blue pitch in their hand. If you play this into Prism to start every single turn, it's also very good because if they have an instant speed aura, so maybe like Genesis or Ode to Wrath, even Parable with Humility, these are cards that they're going to be forced to play immediately because you'll either take the aura itself from their hand or you'll take the card they were going to use to pitch to play it. If you make them overextend like that, it's really beneficial for you, and then you can decide if you either want to deal with the threats on the table, so if you want to now have perfect information to pitch for Arcane Barrier, or if you want to clear the aura, or you can just take the opportunity now, because after that your opponent won't have any cards at all if they have to spend all their cards as a response to the Intimidate trigger, and then you can just completely chunk like half of their life total. So the card's just really good. The only reason why I maybe put it a little bit lower is because I think the next 3 cards just have, I think in my opinion, much stronger effects currently. I just love Barraging Beatdown. It's one of my favorite cards in Brute, and it's why I keep on coming back to the class. Coming in at number 3, we have Beast Within. Beast Within is a really interesting card. So we never really attack with it. That's not really its function. It's mostly here for the discard effect. So if it's ever put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the combat chain, so if it's ever discarded to pay for an additional cost specifically, or if your opponent ever makes you discard a card and you discard this, you banish the top card of your deck and you lose 1 life. And then if that card that you banish has power 6 or more, it goes in your hand. If it doesn't, you repeat the process. So you're always guaranteeing to hit a card. It just depends on how many cards you banish and how much life you lose along the way. So obviously you can get lucky and maybe run cold and hit like 4 or 5 non-attacks in a row and you take a bunch of damage. You can also get really lucky and just rip a 6 attack right off the top, and it just replaces itself, which is really good because a lot of RHINAR cards and the Brute cards specifically have this downside of removing cards from your hand, so it always feels like you were down 1 card in the exchange. However, with Beast Within, it replaces itself. So if you discard this off of a Blood Rush Bellow, you get an extra card. If you discard this off of Wild Ride, then you replace the card. card, things like that. And I think that's really relevant. If you discard it to Reckless Swing, then you'll actually get another card for your own turn, which is really cool. And it's super interesting that Brute has this mechanic. It's not really something you see among the other classes. It really does feel centered to RHINAR and really interesting way of getting back cards. However, Leviah also does play this card from my understanding. So it's just a very strong effect that Brute gets. I would like to see more cards like this in the future, but it's just here because of its pure stats. It's of course a power 6, which is relevant obviously for the discard effects. It blocks for 3, it pitches for yellow, so you can even pitch it to a romping club if you need to. But the effect is just really why it's so high on the list. It just enables a lot of things, and obviously it'll just always be a staple card in the RHINAR lists. Moving on to number 2, we have the card that really pushed the OTK Blitz list this season. Probably one of the most powerful cards that Brute got out of Everfest. Card is incredible. Swing Big is a red 2-cost attack. It blocks for 3 but attacks for a total of 8. And if it doesn't hit, so if it doesn't deal damage to your opponent, the defending hero creates a quicken token when the combat chain closes. That upside is so not relevant ever, because if your opponent blocks out, if they may only be able to play 1 attack on their turn and then they lose a quicken token, or they just have to completely negate their next turn to try to get benefit from the quicken token, and then you just get a whole nother hand to attack them with. Obviously there are some decks that can maybe deal with Swing Big better than others, but the fact that it's simply a 2-cost effect that doesn't require any additional payment, right? Almost every card we've seen here requires something to be taken from you, and normally it's in the form of a discard. So the fact that this is simply just a 2 attack for 8 just on its own is completely overstated, and the potential benefit for the opponent is just so minimal because of the way that LSS is sort of given almost every class really relevant ways to gain Go Again, because you play this at the end of Bloodrush Bellow chains, and so their entire hand is gone anyway. They have no way to feasibly block this, and that's normally how it works, is that you play this at the end of a longer combo chain, and there's just no way for your opponent to even block it, and it's just here to be this blowout finisher that just takes in Blitz half of their life total and in CC a quarter of it. And there's just really no card to compare it to. This feels like probably one of the stronger cards in the Brute card pool right now, especially with its relationship to Bloodrush Bellow, and so just for that reason, it feels like an auto include in the top 3, and I'm pushing it to top 2 just because the effect is just always strong. Even in the Romping Club list, like you just can swing back with this for 8 off of a 2-card hand if you get to keep an extra card. That's just hard to compare. It's hard to compare to the other things on the list. So before we hit number 1, I wanted to include an honorable mention, and the honorable mention is going to be the non-attack 6s with Go Again, so specifically Wild Ride and Pulping. These are both cards that are very strong and have really good effects, but the only reason why I excluded them from the top 10, in my head, these are like 11 and 12. The reason why they just barely don't make the cut is because they're only useful in very specific RHINAR lists. All the cards we've seen today can be played interchangeably between any of the builds out there, but Wild Ride and Pulping are really kind of centered around the claw versions of the deck, so I think that they're just a little bit less strong because they're more niche. The effects themselves are actually very powerful. So having a 6 attack for 2 with Go Again to be followed up with by claws is very strong. I think if people were to find more ways to play this in club builds, it could also be pretty powerful. And I have seen something like that before. I think Yazi played something like that, where you could play Wild Ride and Pulping and follow up with a Romping Club for 5. And I think that's actually pretty solid. I think if those lists kick off a lot more, then I could see these breaking the top 10 list and maybe replacing Massacre or Alpha Rampage. It just depends on where the meta lands this and if these are going to be relevant or not. The only problem is with Dromai coming out, you're really going to want cards that can block Phantasm, and technically non-block cards can actually not block, so you can't pop Phantasms with these because they don't have a block value. They can't be used on defense, and so I think that's a pretty notable consideration. I think the fact they can't block is a huge liability, and I think it can weaken the cards a little bit. Also requires you to keep larger hands to really maximize them, and they can't really be played on smaller hands. Although a 2-card hand for 6 is still decent. Yeah, I just want to include them as an honorable mention. I do think that they are just maybe a little bit outclassed by some of the other things, but I can easily see these being, interchanged, maybe in your own top 10 list, or maybe something like Alpha Rampage or Massacre are not as impactful for you. Maybe these cards are. The only problem is that obviously there is some RNG to these. Even in my testing during Uprising on TTS, I've had a lot of blanked Wild Rides or Pulpings where they just completely brick and you saved a huge hand to go off of them, and now you don't even get Go Again for the rest of your hand. And that can be really frustrating. I've also even had, pretty competitive tournament games where I've played Bloodrush Bellow and then played Wild Ride and just lost Go Again, just because of a non-attack on the top of the deck that I drew and then randomly discarded. And so you just lose out on, some crazy damage, and it's pretty unfortunate, honestly. I could see these easily becoming good in the future. Coming in at number 1, it should be no surprise if you even made it this far. There's no way that this card would not be number 1. In my opinion, Blood Rush Bella is the reason we play Brute. It's the reason why I play Brute. This card never has a moment where it's not impactful. This is the card that pretty much enables almost everything else we've seen in the list today, or everything else is used as a way to support this. This is the premier Brute card. So a Brute attack action costs 1, blocks for 3, pitches for yellow. As an additional cost, you have to discard a random card. Your Brute attacks gain +2 this turn, and if you discarded a card with power 6 or more, when you played Blood Rush Bellow, draw 2 cards and Blood Rush Bellow gains go again. This is the premier combo card in the Blitz list. The way that you play this is you play Blood Rush Bellow, and then you attack with each Mandible Claw for 5 damage each, because they are Brute attacks. They're not, only specifying attack action cards. It's just a Brute attack. So they will get +2, so they come in for 5 with go again each because you've discarded a card to Blood Rush Bellow. And then you can play a finisher at the end of the chain like Swing Big with a Goliath Gauntlet trigger, and so it gets +4 and it comes in for 12. And so that's a 22 damage hand. Same goes for CC. You can play the same line in Claw builds. You can play Massacre at the end of these. You can play Wild Ride, Pulping, and these all gain +2. You can play Wild Ride for 8 go again, play another Wild Ride for 8 go again, attack with Claws. It's absurd. You'll just high roll your opponent like crazy. You can even pitch stack these together, and you can draw multiple. So you can draw a Blood Rush Bellow off of a Blood Rush Bellow, and then play that one, draw 2 more cards. Sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll just roll into those hands, and sometimes you can actually set them up, and there's just simply no way for your opponent to come back from those. You can even deal sometimes over 30 damage in CC, if not completely one-shot your opponent from 40 life if you get lucky enough. And even into the Romping Club builds, it's still just as strong because you can play something like a Romping Club for now 7 off of just a couple cards. So you can do it off of a 2-card hand if it's just Tunic and then a card to discard. You'll obviously get enough cards to pay for Romping Club, and you can just swing for 7 with an Intimidate trigger, and that's sometimes enough. And it still pitches for yellow, so you can pitch it to the Romping Club. You can play something like Massacre after it, or an Alpha Rampage. So in the club build, you're not really going to be going as wide, but you can still abuse it by going tall. And it's just such a solid card. It's just hard not to include it in the spot. Obviously, the Mandible Claw builds abuse it way more than the Romping Club builds, but the strength of this card just instantly puts it in the first place slot. Yeah, thanks for watching. Hopefully this was an interesting way to learn a little bit more about RHINAR, what kind of makes the class tick, what makes a deck list work, what we could ask for in the future from LSS in terms of design, and simply just breaking down why we like the hero, what cards are really enjoyable, and which ones feel particularly strong in the deck list. So let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any disagreements, cards you would include in your top 10, cards you wouldn't include, and yeah, just feel free to have a discussion down in the comments below. Thanks for watching.